This is a special release of an exclusive video from my Patreon. I've had a Patreon for a while now, but over the last few months I've begun to release bonus videos on there, such as How the Incels Found American Psycho, which is an analysis of how a movie that is so critical of the Patrick Batemans of the world could result in an entire subculture worshipping Patrick Bateman. We also just released Sabrina Carpenter, Baby Girl, and the Femme Sub Problematic, which looks into the Sabrina Carpenter album cover scandal as it relates to depictions of female submissiveness in popular culture. Is the anti-conservative backlash to Sabrina kind of conservative in and of itself, or is it striking at a fundamental flaw in femme sub representation? It's a video I could literally never put on YouTube. By subscribing to my Patreon, you're not only getting exclusive bonus videos, you're also supporting this channel and our ability to keep producing incisive, high-quality work. So if these videos interest you, go support us at patreon.com/broadwaydeschanel for exclusive videos, early access to our regular programming, updates, and input about video topics. See you there. If you were a kid or teen in the mid-2000s, you probably remember the first time you watched Napoleon Dynamite. I remember it well. I was at my cousin's house, the place where I watched all the shows and movies that I wasn't allowed to watch at home. And as my cousins and I watched, lying chin in hand on the floor in their parents' bedroom, I remember feeling really grown up. Here I was, 8 years old, watching a movie that was so clearly made for adults. Napoleon Dynamite was a sensation when it hit the indie scene back in 2004, and has been looked upon quite fondly ever since. In many ways, it's almost become synonymous with the concept of the indie film. So why did it take off the way it did? And was it really the revolutionary indie we thought it was when we were young? So grab your spectacles, slide on your moon boots, and grab your llama, because today we're talking about Napoleon Dynamite.
Idiot!
In 2001, Jared and Jerusha Hess were graduates of the film program at Brigham Young University, America's foremost Mormon university, who decided to make a short film called Palooka. At 8 minutes in length and filmed entirely in black and white, Palooka tells the story of a gawky, bespectacled boy who travels to school in a near-empty school bus, befriends 2 Latino kids named Pedro and Gail, goes with them to buy Lotto Max tickets, buys a fanny pack at the thrift store, thanks his new friends for the lovely day, and rides the school bus back home. It has an air of irony to it, but tinged, thanks to its sweet score, with a degree of sentimentality as well. While Palooka is performed entirely in deadpan, it's clear that the film is very much about outcasts finding connection in one another, and you can really tell that the Hesses feel tenderly towards this character that they've created. Palooka premiered at Slam Dance Film Festival, and the Hesses were approached by the brother of a close friend named Jeremy Kuhn, who had recently come into some money and happened to be in attendance, with interest in producing and editing a feature for them. And so, with the support of student discounts on film from Kodak and Panavision, and a whole lot of help from friends and family, a feature film was born. It would be an expansion of the concept from Palooka, this time with the character having the titular name Napoleon. The Hesses wanted their film to be similar in its plotlessness and deadpan delivery, but building more extensively on the themes of friendship and community as well. And so we get Napoleon Dynamite, a tale about a teenage boy who is relatively isolated from the rest of his peers on account of his strangeness.
Hey, Napoleon, what'd you do all last summer again?
I told you, I spent it with my uncle in Alaska hunting wolverines.
But finds a friend in a shy Mexican kid named Pedro who dreams of being class president. The feature film introduces new characters to Napoleon's world, including a love interest named Deb, a similarly bizarre girl from school who travels door to door selling glamour shots, an adrenaline junkie grandmother, a deadbeat grifter uncle named Rico, and an even nerdier and pastier brother named Kip who falls for a sexy city girl he meets online named LaFonda. The film follows Napoleon as he navigates his way through the school year, culminating in a now iconic dance sequence where Napoleon wins Pedro his presidency by performing an impromptu disco routine to Canned Heat by Jamiroquai. Napoleon Dynamite was made without studio involvement on a modest budget of $200,000 from Jeremy Kuhn's cousin, which meant that production was pretty homegrown. It was shot at the Hesses High School, the characters were derived from and sometimes portrayed by people they knew personally, clothing was sourced from the actors directly, like John Hader picked his costume, moon boots, mom jeans, baby tee and all, from a thrift store. John Grease, who played Uncle Rico, bought his own wig from a Korean wig store. Cast and crew were paid around $200 a day, and actors were heavily involved in helping out on set. Hader, the star, who was more involved than anyone, was integral in developing Napoleon's character. He wasn't too far off from Napoleon himself. He went to scout camp and played with nunchucks and bow staffs and made his own boondoggle keychains. Hader also loved to dance. He and his twin brother liked to spend their time going out to the club and making up their own synchronized dance routines, which made him a shoo-in as an in-house choreographer for Napoleon's final dance. But while much of Napoleon is derived from Hess and Hader's own personal experiences, Hader said that, like a cat girl who hisses at you in the hallways, everybody knew a guy like Napoleon growing up. And clearly he resonated, because the movie was a massive hit. Napoleon Dynamite premiered at Sundance in 2004, where it was then picked up by Searchlight and released to theaters with a promotional campaign that targeted college-aged kids. It was very, very effective. Apparently, Faye Dunaway herself was at the premiere and became super obsessed with it, which I just find really funny. On set for the film, it was a running joke that no one would see the movie. And yet, by the end of 2004, Napoleon Dynamite had grossed $150 million internationally, sold 1.4 million DVDs in a single day, won Best Movie at the MTV Movie Awards, got its own Ben & Jerry's ice cream flavor, and an extensive line of merch, the most popular of which were obviously the Vote for Pedro shirts. On top of the universality of its protagonist, there were several reasons that the movie took off the way it did. The mid-2000s were similar to the era we're in now, risk-averse and sequel-ridden, so a movie as quaint and unique as Napoleon Dynamite was sure to be a breath of fresh air. It was infinitely quotable, with odd non-sequiturs and lines of dialogue you would probably go your entire life without hearing.
Can you bring me my chapstick?
No, Napoleon.
But my lips hurt real bad.
I see you're drinking 1%. Is that because you think you're fat?
Well, what's there to eat?
Get off, Napoleon. Make yourself a dang quesadilla.
And young people ate it right up. If I had a nickel for every time a kid yelled out, "Gosh!" or "Tina, you fat lard, come get some dinner." Well, I live in New York, so I'd still be broke, but I would have a lot of nickels. It was also coming at the tail end of an aesthetic era that was dubbed by the podcast NymFet alumni as losercore. On NymFet alumni, they talk about the cultural impact of the 1990 recession and the ways in which America went from aspiring towards upward mobility to instead romanticizing a downwardly mobile lifestyle. In came the loser archetype that took hold over the following decade and manifested in several forms. Kurt Cobain and the grunge movement, loser music like Wheatus's Teenage Dirtbag and Loser by Beck, and a particular brand of indie film that focused heavily on lower middle class teenagers and families in middle America. By 2004, the loser was in some ways the poster child of Americana, such that Napoleon Dynamite, perhaps the most archetypal loser of them all, nunchucks, bifocals, and dad jeans abound, could be welcomed into the zeitgeist with open arms. In a 20-year retrospective for the Washington Post, Jada Ewan writes, "Made for under $400,000, Napoleon Dynamite in many ways marked the end of an era in which something this offbeat, side ponytails, ligers, a cow execution in front of a school bus, could become a word-of-mouth box office phenomenon." And while in many ways Napoleon Dynamite was closing off this offbeat era, it's possible that it may have ushered in something new entirely. Napoleon Dynamite is extremely aesthetically and even thematically similar to some other movies from the mid-2000s. Think Little Miss Sunshine or Juno, both of which feature underdog, oddball characters.
Silencio, old man. Look, I just drank my weight in Sunny D and I gotta go pronto.
The Hoover family and Little Miss Sunshine are all uniquely downtrodden in their own way.
I don't want to be a loser.
And Juno is especially similar to Napoleon in her outcastedness. She's strange and witty and abrasive and doesn't fit in with her peers, which is made worse by her underaged baby bump. She, like Napoleon, has an array of niche interests that she wears proudly, just barely predating the hipster era to come, where cultivating an identity based on knowledge of things unknown became the ultimate status symbol. These characters also come from modest upbringings and are often juxtaposed to upper middle class people from surrounding areas, like Juno going to visit the Lorings, or when the Hoovers stick out like sore thumbs amongst the other families at the beauty pageant. Both movies also place a heavy focus on 80s nostalgia via soundtrack and costuming. Little Miss Sunshine also ends with a climactic dance scene where our protagonist dances her little heart out despite what others may think of her. And as it turns out, all 3 films were released by Searchlight. Searchlight, a then subsidiary of Fox, which focused on distributing independent and art house films, belonged to a wider trend in Hollywood at the time where major studios were creating specialty divisions that focused on smaller scale projects like Napoleon Dynamite. This phenomenon was retroactively called Indiewood, a large-scale project on behalf of the Hollywood majors to boost the production and visibility of mid-budget filmmaking. This resulted in a number of what I like to call hybrid films, the most notable of which, in my mind, being Eternal Sunshine. Shameless plug here for my book. Films that wear the trappings of indie movies, minimal special effects, character-driven and smaller-scale sets, but with a bit larger of a budget, especially when it comes to marketing. The loser films of the 90s had a very different tone than the Searchlight pictures I just mentioned. While films like Welcome to the Dollhouse or Slacker or Ghost World a bit later have elements of comedy, they also have a certain darkness that gives them a bit of an edge.
Teacher was almost blinded.
I was fighting back.
Whoever told you to fight back?
Back in 2002, historian Jeffrey Sconce called these movies American smart films, which he says have a predilection for irony, black humor, and nihilism. Similar to Napoleon Dynamite, these movies are preoccupied with the interpersonal alienation and dysfunction of the white middle-class American family, putting the social satire of films from the 60s and 70s into the home. Smart cinema is usually characterized by its lack of affect, a sort of blank delivery with little emotional intervention on the part of the filmmaker, no matter how sensational or tragic the events of the film may be. But Sconce wondered whether the cultural impact of 9/11 would change this cynical, irony-laden approach to the American middle class now that the country was having to reconstruct a new national mythology, especially as it attempted to galvanize its population into fighting a very ill-defined war. With 9/11, cultural critics questioned whether this age of irony was finally over. Of course, looking at where we are now, it's easy to see that it wasn't over forever. That brief moment of extreme patriotism receded a bit in the following decades as Americans' faith in their government began to wane again. But for the loser, you could see how this end of irony may have taken a hold, at least for the next few years. In his review of Napoleon Dynamite, Roger Ebert said that when he watched the film, he couldn't help but think of Welcome to the Dollhouse. But, he says, that film was informed by anger and passion, and the character fought back. Napoleon seems to passively invite ridicule, and his attempts to succeed have a studied indifference, as if he is mocking his own efforts. This was actually a sentiment espoused by several other critics at the time as well. A.O. Scott said that the Hesses had turned all of the quiet observations and slapstick humor of indie filmmakers like Todd Solondz and Bill Forsyth into an unconvincingly uplifting fairy tale. A group of critics who, back in 2007, compiled a list of 10 films that couldn't have happened without Wes Anderson, cited Napoleon Dynamite as one of these derivatives, and found that the film suggests that audiences prefer filmmakers to hold eccentrics at arm's length. It's easier to mock them and feel the warm, uplifting surge of superiority that way. Truth is, by the time Napoleon Dynamite came out, these critics were simply fatigued by an onslaught of quirk, which seems to have taken over the mainstream. A predecessor to the "rawr, I'm so random" era that my generation came of age during. People started to notice that movies at Sundance, a festival that had once been lauded for boosting movies that would never typically see the light of day, were becoming kind of formulaic. More and more they were about dysfunctional families seeking connection, chosen family, and, family road trips, all with what critics found to be a self-satisfaction with their own strangeness. One particularly befuddled critic, Michael Hirshhorn, called quirk the ruling sensibility of Gen X indie culture, which had been defined by the lovably strange sentimentality of popular media like This American Life, Arrested Development, the films of Wes Anderson, and the work of oddball artists like Miranda July. In a searing polemic, Hirshhorn wrote that quirk was everywhere because it was easy to achieve. Just be odd, but endearing.
Can you just hold on for a second? I'm on my hamburger phone.
You know what I do when I feel completely unoriginal?
Blah, 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 blah.
He said that quirk was becoming a narrative tool in and of itself, writing, "It becomes a kind of psychographic marker, like wearing laceless Chuck Taylors or ironic facial hair, a self-satisfied pose that stands for nothing and doesn't require you to take creative responsibility. Just because you can doesn't mean you should." Whenever I think about Napoleon Dynamite, I'm struck at how it's so overtly emblematic of an indie movie. And when I started writing this video, I did kind of come in with a similar feeling to these critics. While I, who was barred from watching Disney Channel sitcoms for fear that they would give me brain rot, found Napoleon Dynamite to be transgressive when I was a kid. Rewatching as an adult, I did notice that it kind of lacks an edge. Due to the Mormon backgrounds of its director and lead actor, it contains a conspicuous lack of swearing.
Kip hasn't done flipping anything today.
Napoleon, give me some of your tots.
No, go find your own.
Come on, give me some of your tots.
No, I'm freaking starved. I didn't get to eat anything today.
Jon Heder had actually turned down a lot of work in the years since because it was too raunchy, and even rooted for Mitt Romney during the 2008 Republican primaries. The movie is delivered in that same blank affect as the 90s loser films.
I did some drawings for the flyers.
Thanks.
But its stakes tend to be much lower, to the point that the movie, aside from the loose tendrils of Pedro's presidential campaign and Napoleon's courtship of Deb, neither events of which seem to have much bearing on the characters because of that deadpan delivery, is somewhat plotless. Most of the film is purely observational of Napoleon's bizarre behaviors, and these loose strings of plot are resolved rather quickly at the very end. After Napoleon performs his dance, we tie things up with a montage of all the characters now seemingly fulfilled. Pedro celebrates his miraculous wins surrounded by family, Grandma is back and feeding Tina, Napoleon and Deb reconcile on the tetherball court. Why doesn't the relationship between Deb and Pedro ever bloom? Why do Pedro and Napoleon never have a conversation about Napoleon's interest in Deb? And why does Deb choose to forgive Napoleon beyond being impressed by his dance? On initial rewatch, it appears that Napoleon Dynamite may be quirky for quirk's sake. But then I read an article by Matt Feeney, which was written as a response to the anti-quirk backlash, where he said something that caught my eye. Of the quirked up movie of the mid-aughts, he says, "These characters are odd in a very formalized comedic way. Self-consciousness is part of the setup. They are almost real people displaced into cuckoo land by a series of transparent indie conceits. The telltale stylistic quirks, the lingering close-ups, the deadpan tone, grant these characters the sort of dignity they wouldn't have in a studio comedy, even as it readies you to see them doing some quite improbable things." It could possibly be then that narrative or deeper meaning aren't actually the point of a film like Napoleon Dynamite. Rather, the observational ambiance is really all these movies need to be a mouthpiece for the loser, the misunderstood. Smart cinema may have had a sharper or clearer social satire than Napoleon Dynamite, but it also often looked upon its loser characters with harsh indifference. I disagree with the idea that the Hesses are approaching their characters from a place of superiority or mockery. I think they really love these characters they've created and want the best for them. Whatever sentimentality or plotlessness you could use to critique the film can also be used to praise it. Because while Napoleon Dynamite may have taken the edge out of the smart cinema indie, I think, in turn, it gave it a heart. I said the movie is observational, but what is it observing? Well, beyond building out Napoleon's own idiosyncratic take on the loser, the Hesses also create an atmosphere of a very distinct kind of Americana, in this case, the American rural West. Many of the smart films and searchlight films I mentioned take place in Middle America, states and communities of the US that are often overlooked, maybe even underserved. Their inhabitants are perceived by those on the coasts as the dregs of America, light years behind the coasts both ideologically and culturally. Of course, this obviously isn't true across the board, but what the Hesses do with Napoleon Dynamite is walk the line between pointing out these truths while also finding value in the oddities that come out of these more secluded regions. And they do so by using frontier humor. 20 years later, and the movie is still genuinely really funny. But the humor is quieter, existing less in punchlines like it would in other comedies around this time, and more so in just letting us watch these weirdos do their thing.
The defect in that one is bleach.
What do you think, money grows on trees in this family? Take it back. Get some Pampers for you and your brother while you're at it.
Are you ready to get your groove on? Yes.
The film's use of 80s style and technology exposes how much longer it takes for Middle America to keep up with popular culture. Of his own hometown in Idaho, which was somewhat more connected than the town of Preston, Heder recalls, "You had access to the local video rental shop and that's it. They didn't really watch MTV. This was Grandma's house. Napoleon just had a VHS player. It's the most like a post-apocalyptic scenario. It's like a Wall-E. They're running around this world full of leftovers and junk, with nobody to explain or put him into perspective. Napoleon's world is dated to the point that it's hard to pinpoint what decade the characters are in. Side ponytails, glamour shots, high-rise jeans, Walkmans are all front and center in this world. It all feels normal until LaFonda arrives and sends us crashing back to the present day. While it all may feel played up for the movie, this really was the reality. Shonderella Avery, who plays LaFonda, recounted, "Even at the Salt Lake City airport, I just remember everyone ogling me, like, who is this human being? Like, they had never seen a black person before. And they had not. I was like, this is amazing, all this extra attention I'm getting. The local newspaper wanted to write about me, and there was always this white guy reporter standing behind the trees looking at me. I was like, if I'm ever gonna be a star, I think it's happening in Preston, Idaho. This is magical." Scholar Nicholas Mink calls this observational, oddball focus on Middle America, like I said, frontier humor. The tradition of frontier humor in films like Raising Arizona or The Big Lebowski or Napoleon Dynamite is to bring to light the various social, cultural, and economic conditions that set the American West so apart from the rest of the country. Usually these conditions, perceived by the rest as backwater and uncivilized, are then positioned next to the more urban and civilized aspects of America, like having LaFonda date Kip, for example, which is where the humor comes out. Mink says that Napoleon Dynamite in particular helps to expose the underlying anxieties, stereotypes, assumptions, and hopes that still underscore much of the fraught relationship between the rural West and the rest of America. But it does so all the while pushing a message about acceptance and tolerance, using a misfit as its hero. Despite what critics have charged, the quirk of Napoleon Dynamite was not done in a slapdash way. The movie was filmed on 35mm film and thus has a richer look than a lot of movies from its time that were turning to digital, and ultimately comes across remarkably sophisticated for such a tiny production. From the very first moment, which is a carefully timed credit sequence that displays different bespoke objects lying in Napoleon's environments, each with a different name on them, you can tell that the Hesses put a great deal of care into the details of this film. There's still a layer of irony there, maybe even some mean-spiritedness. I mean, I like Napoleon because he isn't some maligned nerd with a heart of gold. He's kind of a dickhead teenage boy. But there's also a purity and innocence to Napoleon that endears us to him. For all the blank delivery, the characters are shockingly earnest.
Pedro, just listen to your heart. That's what I do.
When they screened the movie in Preston, response from the locals ranged from confusion to outright dislike. But I don't think the frontier humor of Napoleon Dynamite is necessarily for all Middle Americans. It seems instead that it's for people born to these regions who don't necessarily fit into them, like the Hesses, like John Hader, and like Napoleon and Pedro and Deb. Even Hirschhorn, Quirk's biggest hater, acquiesced that Quirk takes the idea of not mattering very seriously, and that when used right, it has the potential to unlock that hoary emotion called sentiment, which had been more or less banished in the 90s. The movie's message may be as simple as love yourself, but at a time where everything is slowly starting to look the same, and conformity seems to once again be on the rise, a movie that picks out our differences, odd little treasures in places and people you would never think to look, and treats them tenderly, is just what we need. Maybe tender truths and feelings of acceptance are the perfect antidote for a broken country.